The parachute silk billowed like a ghost against the midnight sky as Captain Sarah Chen plummeted toward the most dangerous territory on Earth. Below her, the rugged mountains of Afghanistan stretched endlessly, hiding Taliban strongholds where no woman had ever set foot and survived. In 12 hours, she would either complete the most audacious special operations mission in military history or become another name carved into black granite at Arlington Cemetery. What the enemy didn't know was that they had just encountered something far more lethal than any weapon in the American arsenal, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The rules of engagement were about to change forever, and Sarah Chen was about to rewrite the playbook on what special operations could achieve when desperation meets determination. This is her story. This is how one woman's mission behind enemy lines would expose the hidden potential that the military establishment had been overlooking for decades, and why her actions that night would force the Pentagon to completely reimagine the future of warfare itself. The wind cut through Sarah Chen like a blade as she checked her altimeter for the third time in 30 seconds. 2,000 feet and dropping fast, the Hindu Kush Mountains rose like jagged teeth beneath her, their snow-capped peaks gleaming silver in the moonlight. Somewhere in those treacherous valleys lay her target, a Taliban commander who had been ghost for 3 years, responsible for 17 American deaths and countless civilian casualties. Sarah adjusted her grip on the parachute cords, feeling the familiar weight of her gear pressing against her back. 47 pounds of specialized equipment, including experimental communication devices that could mean the difference between success and becoming another casualty statistic. At 28, she had already completed more high-risk operations than most Special Forces veterans saw in their entire careers. Tonight would either crown her achievements or end them permanently. The mission briefing had been classified at the highest levels. Only 6 people in the Pentagon knew what Sarah was attempting, and half of them had voted against sending her. The intelligence was solid, but the risks were astronomical. The target, Abdul Qadir Rahman, had built his reputation on the brutal execution of anyone who dared to challenge his authority in the remote Kunar province. His compound was a fortress carved into the mountainside, protected by natural barriers and fanatically loyal fighters who would die before allowing an outsider to reach their leader. Sarah had volunteered for the mission despite knowing the odds. Her younger brother Marcus had been killed in an IED explosion 6 months earlier, his convoy ambushed by Rahman's forces while delivering medical supplies to a village school. The official reports called it collateral damage in the ongoing fight against terrorism. Sarah called it murder, and she had been planning her response ever since the folded flag was placed in her mother's trembling hands. The military establishment had initially rejected her request to lead the operation. Women weren't supposed to engage in direct combat roles, especially not solo missions into hostile territory. But Sarah had something the brass couldn't ignore: an unprecedented success rate and a skill set that had been refined through years of covert operations that never made it into official records. She spoke fluent Dari and Pashto, could disappear into local populations like a shadow, and possessed an intuitive understanding of Taliban psychology that had proven invaluable in previous missions. 1,000 feet. Sarah could make out the rocky outcroppings and narrow paths that would either provide cover or become death traps depending on how carefully she navigated the next few hours. Her primary landing zone was a small clearing approximately 2 miles from Rahman's compound. Intelligence suggested it was unguarded, used only by local shepherds who avoided the area after dark due to the Taliban presence. The parachute harness cut into her shoulders as she prepared for landing. Sarah had trained for this moment in the Nevada desert, the mountains of Colorado, and a dozen other locations that approximated the terrain she was now approaching. But training couldn't replicate the psychological pressure of knowing that every decision from this point forward would determine whether she completed the mission or joined her brother in Arlington National Cemetery. Her radio crackled with static as the command center attempted to establish final communications. Eagle 7, this is base. Confirm your position and status. The voice belonged to Colonel Martinez, the only superior officer who had supported her mission from the beginning. He understood what Rahman represented to Sarah, and more importantly, he understood what Sarah represented to the future of special operations.
Base, this is Eagle 7.
Approaching primary LZ. All systems green. Sarah kept her voice steady and professional, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. In less than 5 minutes, she would be completely alone in enemy territory, with no backup and no extraction plan beyond her own abilities. The ground rushed up to meet her with startling suddenness. Sarah executed a perfect PLF parachute landing, rolling with the impact to distribute the force across her body. The silence that followed was deafening. No alarms, no shouting, no indication that her arrival had been detected. She quickly gathered her parachute and buried it beneath a pile of rocks, then activated the GPS beacon that would allow command to track her approximate position. Sarah moved through the darkness like a predator, every sense heightened to maximum awareness. The terrain was even more treacherous than the satellite imagery had suggested. Loose rocks shifted underfoot with every step, threatening to send cascades of stone echoing through the valleys. The thin air at 8,000 feet made every breath a conscious effort, but she maintained a steady pace toward the objective. The compound appeared exactly as described in the intelligence briefings, a collection of mud brick buildings connected by narrow walkways and protected by high walls topped with razor wire. Guard towers at each corner housed sentries armed with automatic weapons and night vision equipment. What the briefings hadn't captured was the sheer intimidating presence of the place, perched on its rocky ledge like a medieval fortress designed to repel any assault. Sarah positioned herself behind a boulder approximately 300 yards from the main gate and began her reconnaissance. Through her scope, she could identify at least 12 guards on the perimeter, with unknown numbers inside the buildings. The central structure, where Rahman was believed to reside, showed lights in 3 windows on the upper floor. Intelligence suggested he preferred to sleep in a room facing east, toward Mecca, but Sarah couldn't afford to rely on assumptions. The first phase of her plan required patience above all else. Sarah settled into her observation position and began the methodical process of mapping guard rotations, identifying weak points in the perimeter, and calculating approach routes that would minimize her exposure. She had learned during her previous operations that rushing into action was the fastest way to turn a mission into a casualty report. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Sarah observed the changing of the guard at midnight, noting that the replacement sentries were less alert than their predecessors. She watched as lights went out in various buildings, until only the central structure remained illuminated. Most importantly, she confirmed that Rahman was indeed in the compound. His distinctive silhouette appeared briefly in an upper-floor window as he performed his evening prayers. The cold began to seep through her specialized clothing as the night wore on. At this altitude, temperatures could drop below freezing even during summer months. Sarah forced herself to remain motionless despite the discomfort, knowing that any unnecessary movement could compromise her position. She had trained herself to endure far worse conditions during her preparation, spending entire nights in sub-zero temperatures, without shelter or heat sources. As dawn approached, Sarah made her final preparations. The assault would begin at first light, when the guards would be at their most vulnerable, due to fatigue and the psychological effects of the changing shift. She checked her weapons one final time: a suppressed pistol, tactical knife, and small explosive charges designed for breaching doors and eliminating specific targets. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, but incredibly complex in execution. Sarah would infiltrate the compound using a drainage culvert that intelligence had identified during satellite reconnaissance. Once inside, she would neutralize guards silently while moving toward Rahman's quarters. The kill itself would take less than 30 seconds, but escaping the compound alive would require every skill she had developed over years of covert operations. Sarah activated her comm device and sent a brief coded message to command. Eagle 7 beginning final approach. Will report when objective is complete. From this point forward, she was entirely on her own, carrying out a mission that could reshape how the military thought about special operations and the role of women in combat. The drainage culvert was exactly where the intelligence reports had indicated, but it was smaller than expected. Sarah had to remove most of her gear and push it ahead of her as she crawled through the narrow concrete tube. The sound of her movement seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space, though she knew it was barely audible from outside. Every few feet she paused to listen for any indication that her approach had been detected. Emerging from the culvert required careful timing. Sarah waited until the nearest guard tower was facing away from her position, then slipped out of the drainage opening and pressed herself against the inner wall of the compound. She was now inside Rahman's fortress, surrounded by enemies who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her presence. The first guard never knew what hit him. Sarah approached from behind as he stood at his post, applied a sleeper hold that rendered him unconscious in seconds, then dragged his body into the shadows where it wouldn't be discovered until the next shift change. 1 down, 11 to go. Moving through the compound required absolute precision. Sarah had memorized the layout during her reconnaissance, but the reality of navigating between buildings while avoiding detection was far more challenging than studying blueprints. She used shadows, architectural features, and carefully timed movements to remain invisible to the other guards. The second and third eliminations went smoothly. Sarah had identified a patrol route that brought guards within striking distance of her hiding places at predictable intervals. Each takedown was swift and silent, leaving no trace except for missing sentries who wouldn't be discovered until morning. But the fourth guard proved more challenging. As Sarah prepared to neutralize another sentry, she heard voices approaching from an unexpected direction. 3 guards were conducting an unscheduled patrol, moving directly toward her position. Sarah pressed herself into an alcove between 2 buildings and controlled her breathing while the armed men passed within feet of her hiding place. One of the guards paused directly in front of her alcove and said something in Pashto to his companions. Sarah understood every word. He had noticed that one of his colleagues wasn't at his usual post and was suggesting they investigate. The other guards dismissed his concerns, but Sarah knew she was running out of time before the missing sentries were discovered. The central building loomed ahead of her, its upper floor windows glowing with warm light. Somewhere behind those walls, Abdul Qadir Rahan was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his years of brutality were about to come to an end. Sarah checked her weapons one final time and began the most dangerous phase of her mission, infiltrating the heavily guarded building where her target waited. The main building's entrance was protected by 2 guards positioned on either side of a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Sarah crouched behind a supply shed 30 yards away, studying their positions and trying to calculate an approach that wouldn't result in gunfire and alarms. The element of surprise was her greatest advantage, and once lost, it couldn't be recovered. Through her night vision scope, Sarah observed the guards' routine. Every 10 minutes, they would exchange a few words in Pashto, usually complaints about the cold or speculation about when their shift would end. Neither man appeared particularly alert, but their positioning made a simultaneous takedown nearly impossible. Sarah would have to eliminate them sequentially, which meant the second guard would have perhaps 3 seconds to react before she could reach him. The decision came down to acceptable risk versus mission success. Sarah had trained for scenarios exactly like this. 1. Practicing knife throws in close-quarters combat until her responses became automatic. But training couldn't account for the adrenaline that now flooded her system, or the knowledge that Marcus's death would go unavenged if she failed in the next few minutes. Sarah moved like liquid shadow across the open ground between the shed and the building. Her approach angle kept her in the blind spot of the guard tower to her left, while the natural curvature of the building blocked line of sight from other positions. When she was within striking distance, she drew her tactical knife and prepared for what had to be perfect execution. The first guard died without making a sound. Sarah's blade found the precise spot between his ribs that would pierce his heart, while her other hand covered his mouth. She lowered his body gently to the ground and was moving toward the second guard before the first man's weapon hit the dirt. The second elimination was equally swift and silent, leaving both sentries dead at their posts, in positions that appeared normal from a distance. Sarah dragged both bodies into the shadows beside the entrance and retrieved the keyring from the senior guard's belt. The building's interior was dimly lit by oil lamps placed at strategic intervals along the hallways. Sarah could hear voices from somewhere deep in the structure, but the sounds were muffled and didn't suggest any awareness of her presence. Intelligence reports had indicated that Rahman's quarters were located on the second floor at the end of a corridor that ran the length of the building. Sarah climbed the wooden staircase with infinite care, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. The old wood creaked ominously despite her precautions, but the sounds were masked by wind that howled through gaps in the building's construction. The second-floor hallway stretched ahead of her like a tunnel leading into darkness. Sarah could see light beneath 3 doors, indicating occupied rooms, but only the door at the far end matched the intelligence description of Rahman's quarters. She moved along the corridor, keeping close to the wall where the floorboards would be best supported and least likely to betray her presence. Halfway down the hallway, Sarah heard voices from one of the lit rooms. The conversation was in Arabic rather than Pashto, suggesting the presence of foreign fighters who had joined Rahman's organization. Sarah paused outside the door and listened carefully, trying to determine how many men were inside and whether they represented a threat to her mission. The Arabic was heavily accented but clear enough for Sarah to understand. 3 men were discussing supply routes and weapons shipments, routine logistics that would normally hold no interest for her. But one name mentioned repeatedly made her blood run cold. They were planning an attack on a medical convoy scheduled to travel through the same area where Marcus had been killed. Sarah faced a tactical dilemma that hadn't been covered in her mission briefing. Her primary objective was Raymond's elimination, but the intelligence she had just overheard could save American lives if she could somehow relay it to command. The problem was that using her communications equipment inside the building would risk detection, and any delay might allow Raymond to escape or discover her presence. The decision required split-second judgment based on incomplete information. Sarah chose to continue toward Ramon's quarters, memorizing the details of the planned convoy attack to relay later if she survived the next few minutes. The mission parameters were clear: eliminate the target and extract if possible. Everything else was secondary. Rahman's door was secured with a modern lock that seemed out of place in the ancient building. Sarah examined it carefully and realized that standard lock-picking techniques wouldn't work within an acceptable time frame. Instead, she retrieved a small explosive charge designed for precisely this situation. The shaped charge would blow the lock without damaging the door enough to create obvious evidence of forced entry. The explosion was barely louder than a book falling to the floor, but in the silence of the building it seemed to echo like thunder. Sarah waited 30 seconds for any response, then slowly pushed the door open and stepped into Raymond's quarters. The room was larger than expected, furnished with expensive carpets and furniture that reflected Raymond's status within the Taliban hierarchy. A man slept peacefully on an ornate bed in the far corner, his beard and features matching the photographs Sarah had memorized during mission preparation. Abdul Qadir Rahman, the monster responsible for her brother's death, lay completely vulnerable and unaware that his time had finally come. Sarah approached the bed with her suppressed pistol drawn. At this range, there was no possibility of missing or merely wounding her target. Rahman would die quickly and silently, his reign of terror ending with the same abruptness that had characterized his victims' deaths. Sarah aimed the weapon at Rahman's head and began to apply pressure to the trigger. The sleeping man's eyes opened suddenly and locked onto hers. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the killer and his executioner stared at each other across the space that separated life from death. Rahman's expression showed no fear, only a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested he had always known this moment would eventually arrive. "You are American," Rahman said quietly in accented English. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing weather rather than his imminent death. "Military. Special operations. Very impressive that you reached this room alive." Sarah kept her weapon trained on his head but didn't fire immediately. Something in Rahman's manner suggested he had been expecting her or someone like her. The compound's defenses had seemed adequate but not exceptional for someone of his status. Now she wondered if the relatively easy infiltration had been allowed to happen for reasons she couldn't yet understand. "You killed my brother," Sarah said simply. "Marcus Chen, medic with the 327th Infantry. His convoy was destroyed by your people 6 months ago." Rahman nodded slowly, as if accessing a mental database of the violence he had orchestrated over the years. "The medical supplies," he said after a moment. "Yes, I remember. Your brother died quickly, if that provides any comfort. My men are efficient killers." The casual acknowledgement of Marcus's murder nearly shattered Sarah's professional control. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but something made her pause again. Rahman was behaving unlike any target she had encountered in previous operations. Most facing imminent death either begged for mercy or attempted to escape. Rahman seemed almost relieved. "You wonder why I do not call for help," Rahman observed. "Why I have not already alerted my guards to your presence. Perhaps you suspect a trap." Sarah maintained her aim but remained silent, waiting for an explanation that might help her understand the strange dynamics of this confrontation. Her training had prepared her for resistant targets, cooperative targets, and everything in between. But Rahman was something entirely different, a target who seemed to welcome his own execution. "I am tired," Rahman continued, his voice growing softer. "Tired of death, tired of war, tired of being surrounded by men who see nothing beyond their hatred. You have given me something I have not had in many years. A worthy opponent who understands the true cost of violence." The philosophical turn in their conversation struck Sarah as surreal given the circumstances, but she recognized that Rahman was revealing something important about himself, and possibly about the intelligence that had led her to this room. She adjusted her grip on the pistol, but kept it trained on her target while he continued speaking. "Your military believes that killing me will disrupt our operations in this region," Rahman said. "They are correct, but not for the reasons they think. I have been preventing far worse violence than what my reputation suggests. There are others who would take my place, men who lack my restraint." Sarah felt the first stirrings of doubt about her mission parameters. If Raymond was telling the truth, his elimination might actually increase rather than decrease the threat to American forces and civilian populations. But intelligence had been clear about his responsibility for Marcus's death and numerous other attacks. The man lying before her was either a master manipulator or someone whose actual role was far more complex than the briefings had suggested. "My brother died because of your orders," Sarah said firmly. "That convoy was carrying medical supplies to help children. There was no military significance, Your brother died because I was not present when the attack was planned, Rahman replied. My subordinates acted without my knowledge or approval. When I learned what they had done, I executed the 3 men responsible for targeting a medical mission. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Rahman was telling the truth, then Marcus had died not as part of some grand strategic plan but due to the unauthorized actions of individuals who had themselves been killed for their transgression. The moral certainty that had driven her through months of preparation and the dangerous mission itself began to crack under the weight of this new information. You lie, Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. Something in Rahman's manner suggested he was speaking truthfully, or at least revealing what he believed to be true. The intelligence picture that had seemed so clear during mission planning was becoming muddied with contradictions and unexpected complexity. Rahman slowly reached toward a table beside his bed, moving carefully to avoid triggering a defensive reaction from Sarah. He retrieved a leather folder and held it out toward her. The execution orders, he said, signed by my own hand. Your brother's death violated our code regarding medical personnel and humanitarian missions. Sarah accepted the folder with her free hand while maintaining her aim with the weapon. The documents inside were written in Arabic, but she could read enough to understand their general content. 3 death warrants, each bearing Rahman's distinctive signature, each specifying that the condemned men had violated operational protocols by attacking non-combatants. The documents appeared genuine, but Sarah knew they could have been prepared specifically for this encounter, if Rahman had somehow anticipated her mission. Yet the level of detail and the bureaucratic formatting suggested they were authentic military records rather than hastily constructed deceptions. Why show me this? Sarah asked. Why not simply deny responsibility or claim it was necessary for tactical reasons? Because I want you to understand that your brother's death accomplished nothing, Rahman replied. He died for no reason beyond the stupidity and bloodthirst of men I trusted to follow orders. If you kill me tonight, you will have your revenge, but you will not have avenged your brother's memory. The moral complexity of Rahman's argument created a crisis that Sarah's training hadn't prepared her to handle. The mission parameters were clear: eliminate the target and extract. But the conversation had revealed layers of meaning and responsibility that called into question everything she thought she knew about why Marcus had died. Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway outside Rahman's quarters, approaching at a measured pace that suggested routine rather than alarm. Someone was coming to check on Rahman or deliver a report. And Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds before the situation became exponentially more dangerous. She had to make a decision about Rahman's fate while processing information that challenged her fundamental assumptions about justice and revenge. The doorknob began to turn slowly as someone entered Rahman's quarters without knocking. Sarah pivoted toward the sound while keeping her weapon trained generally in Rahman's direction. A young man in traditional Afghan dress stepped into the room carrying a tray of tea, and immediately froze when he saw the armed American woman standing over his leader's bed. For a moment, nobody moved. The young Afghan's eyes darted between Sarah and Rahman, clearly trying to process the unprecedented situation. Sarah realized she was now facing a 3-way confrontation with multiple possible outcomes, none of which had been covered in her mission planning. Rahman remained motionless on his bed, watching the unfolding drama with apparent fascination rather than concern for his own safety. The young Afghan's hand moved slowly toward the pistol at his waist, but Rahman spoke a sharp command in Pashto that froze him mid-motion. Sarah understood the words. Rahman had ordered the man to remain still and not interfere. The tea tray trembled in the young man's hands as he struggled to comprehend why his leader was protecting an American assassin. His name is Tariq, Rahman said to Sarah in English. My nephew. 17 years old. He has never fired a shot in anger, never harmed anyone. If you kill me, he will spend the rest of his life seeking revenge against Americans. If you let me live, he will learn that violence is not always the answer to every problem. Sarah recognized the manipulation in Rahman's words, but she also saw the truth in the young man's terrified expression. Tariq was clearly not a hardened fighter, but rather a family member caught in circumstances beyond his understanding. His death would be meaningless, and allowing him to witness his uncle's execution would indeed create another cycle of violence. Tell him to leave, Sarah commanded, keeping her weapon trained on Rahman while monitoring Tariq's position with her peripheral vision. Now. Rahman spoke again in Pashto, his tone gentle but firm. Tariq responded with what sounded like protests, but Rahman cut him off with a gesture. The young man reluctantly backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving Sarah's weapon. When he reached the threshold, he spoke one final time to his uncle, and Rahman's response seemed to reassure him. I told him that Allah's will would be done, Rahman explained after Tariq had left the room. He believes that if I die tonight, it will be because I have served my purpose and my time has ended. He will not seek revenge because he believes you are an instrument of divine justice. The theological framework that Rahman had imposed on their confrontation struck Sarah as both sophisticated and manipulative, but she recognized its practical importance. If Rahman's family and followers believed his death was divinely ordained rather than the result of American military action, the likelihood of reprisal attacks would be significantly reduced. Sarah heard voices from elsewhere in the building, suggesting that others were awake and moving around. The longer she remained in Rahman's quarters, the greater the chance of discovery and the tactical nightmare of fighting her way out of a compound filled with armed enemies. Yet the conversation with Rahman had revealed intelligence that could affect American operations throughout the region. "The convoy attack your men were planning," Sarah said. "Give me the details." Rahman smiled slightly, as if he had been expecting this request. "Medical supplies again, traveling from Jalalabad to Asadabad next Thursday. My subordinates believe it contains weapons and military equipment hidden among the humanitarian cargo. They are wrong, but they will attack anyway unless someone prevents them." Sarah processed this information while maintaining her defensive posture. The convoy Rahman described matched intelligence reports of a legitimate humanitarian mission scheduled to deliver medicine and supplies to civilian populations. If his men attacked it, the casualties would include both American service members and the Afghan civilians the convoy was meant to help. "How do I know you're not lying to buy time?" Sarah asked. "Because you will be dead within minutes if I am lying," Rahman replied matter-of-factly. "My guards will discover your presence soon and you will die fighting your way out of this compound. I gain nothing by deceiving you except a few additional minutes of life, and a man in my position learns not to cling to such small advantages." The logic was sound, but Sarah recognized that Raymond was a master strategist who had survived years of warfare through his ability to outthink his enemies. Everything he said could be calculated to achieve some objective she hadn't identified. Yet the urgency of the convoy situation demanded immediate action regardless of Rahman's motivations. Sarah activated her concealed communications device and transmitted a coded burst transmission to command. The message contained the convoy warning, along with her current position and status. Whether anyone would receive it in time to act depended on factors beyond her control, but she had done what she could to prevent another tragedy like the one that had claimed Marcus. "Now we return to our original business," Sarah said, refocusing her weapon on Rahman's head. "You killed my brother." "Yes," Rahman agreed simply. "Through negligence, through failure to control my subordinates, through the chaos that surrounds all military operations. I am responsible for Marcus Chen's death, and I accept that responsibility." The acknowledgement should have provided Sarah with the satisfaction she had sought through months of planning and preparation, but instead it left her feeling oddly empty. Rahman's acceptance of responsibility was complete and unqualified, but it was also impersonal, almost bureaucratic. There was no drama, no begging, no attempt to minimize his culpability. "Any last words?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to offer him the opportunity. "Only this," Rahman said, meeting her eyes directly. "Your brother died helping people who needed medical care. If you kill me tonight, make sure my death serves a similar purpose." Do not let it be meaningless violence added to the endless cycle of revenge that has consumed this region for decades. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger as she prepared to end Abdul Qadir Rahman's life. At this range, with this weapon, there would be no suffering, no prolonged agony. Rahman would simply cease to exist, his consciousness extinguished as abruptly as Marcus's had been during the IED explosion. But something made her pause one final time. Rahman's words about meaningful death versus meaningless violence resonated with principles that Marcus himself had embodied during his service as a combat medic. Marcus had risked his life repeatedly to save wounded soldiers and civilians, never asking about their politics or allegiances, focused only on reducing suffering wherever he found it. "There's something else," Rahman said quietly, interpreting her hesitation correctly. "Information that might interest your military planners, a network of tunnels connecting several compounds in this valley. Maps, supply caches, communication equipment, all hidden in a location that your satellites cannot detect." Sarah recognized another potential manipulation, but the tactical value of such intelligence would be enormous if Raymond was telling the truth. Underground networks had been used throughout Afghanistan to move personnel and equipment while avoiding American surveillance and airstrikes. Detailed knowledge of such a system could save countless American lives in future operations. Where? Sarah demanded. Rahman smiled and shook his head slowly. That information has value only if I remain alive to provide it. Dead men tell no secrets, and my followers will destroy everything rather than let it fall into American hands. The negotiation had reached its crucial point. Rahman was offering to trade intelligence for his life, but accepting such a deal would mean abandoning her mission and leaving Marcus's killer alive and unpunished. Sarah felt the weight of command decisions she wasn't trained to make, choices between personal justice and strategic advantage that had no clear right answer. Voices were growing louder in other parts of the building, and Sarah could hear movement that suggested guards were beginning to notice their missing colleagues. Whatever decision she made had to happen immediately, before tactical circumstances forced her hand by making escape impossible. Sarah lowered her weapon slightly but kept it ready for instant use. The tunnel locations. Now. Rahman sat up slowly and reached for a map on his bedside table. He spread it across his lap and pointed to several locations marked with symbols that would mean nothing to casual observers but indicated significant tactical positions to someone with military training. 3 primary entrances, Rahman explained, his finger tracing routes on the map, connected to weapons storage, communication centers, and escape routes that lead to the Pakistani border. Your forces have been looking for these tunnels for 2 years without success. Sarah memorized the locations, while keeping part of her attention focused on sounds from elsewhere in the building. The tactical value of the tunnel system was obvious, but she still had no way to verify Rahman's claims without risking the success of her mission. She was being forced to make command-level decisions based on incomplete information and personal judgment. Why tell me this? Sarah asked. What do you gain? Perhaps I grow tired of watching young men die for causes they barely understand. Rahman replied. Perhaps I hope that better intelligence will lead to more surgical operations rather than the broad devastation that kills civilians along with fighters. Or perhaps I simply want to live long enough to see whether peace is possible in this valley. The philosophical answer was probably sincere, but Sarah recognized that Rahman's primary motivation was survival. He was trading information for his life, gambling that the intelligence was valuable enough to outweigh the military's desire for his elimination. Whether that gamble would prove correct depended on decisions that would be made far above Sarah's level of authority. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside Rahman's quarters, approaching with purpose rather than routine patrol. Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds before the situation became a firefight that she might not survive. She made her decision with the cold calculation that special operations demanded, setting aside personal emotions in favor of tactical advantages. You're coming with me, Sarah announced, raising her weapon to cover Rahman while he slowly stood from his bed. Move toward the window. We're leaving together. Rahman nodded approvingly, as if Sarah had passed some kind of test by choosing strategic value over personal revenge. My men will not fire if they believe you might kill me during your escape, he observed. A useful advantage for someone in your current situation. Sarah positioned Rahman between herself and the door, while she examined the window that faced the compound's eastern wall. The drop was substantial but manageable with proper technique, and the angle would provide concealment from most of the guard positions. More importantly, it offered a route that avoided the main corridors where armed men were now searching for intruders. Move, Sarah commanded, keeping her weapon pressed against Rahman's back as they approached the window. Any attempt to alert your men, any sudden movements, and you die immediately. Rahman opened the window and looked down at the courtyard below. 20 feet, he estimated. Painful but survivable. Your extraction plan? Sarah didn't respond to the question, but she was already calculating distances and angles that would get them beyond the compound walls. The original mission plan called for her to escape alone, using predetermined routes and rendezvous points. Taking Rahman as a prisoner would complicate everything, but it also provided opportunities that hadn't existed when her only objective was his elimination. The voices in the hallway were directly outside Rahman's door. Sarah heard the doorknob rattle as someone tried to enter, followed by surprised voices when the visitors discovered the bodies of the guards she had killed earlier. Within seconds, the entire compound would be on alert, searching for the intruders who had somehow penetrated their defenses. Now, Sarah said, pushing Rahman toward the window opening. Jump. Rahman went through the window without hesitation, landing hard but rolling to absorb the impact. Sarah followed immediately, her own landing cushioned by years of airborne training and special operations experience. They were now in the compound's main courtyard, exposed to observation from multiple directions, but closer to the outer walls that represented safety. Alarms began sounding from the main building as Raman's guards discovered the scene in his quarters. Spotlights swept across the courtyard, searching for targets that were already moving toward the compound's weakest defensive point. Sarah had identified the location during her reconnaissance, a section of wall that was partially concealed by a storage building, and offered handholds that would allow them to climb to freedom. "This way," Sarah directed, keeping her weapon trained on Raymond while they moved through shadows toward their escape route. Behind them, armed men were pouring out of buildings, shouting orders and organizing search teams. Within minutes, the entire area would be crawling with enemies who would shoot both Sarah and Raman on sight rather than risk allowing their leader to be captured. They reached the wall just as the first search team rounded the corner of the storage building. Sarah fired 3 suppressed shots that sent the men diving for cover, buying precious seconds for their escape attempt. She boosted Raman up the wall first, keeping him in front of her where she could maintain control. Then followed him to the top of the barrier that separated them from the open mountainside beyond. The drop on the outside of the wall was greater than Sarah had calculated from her reconnaissance position. Both she and Raman hit the rocky ground hard, and she heard Raman grunt with pain as his shoulder struck a protruding stone. But they were outside the compound, beyond the immediate reach of the search teams that were now flooding the courtyard they had just escaped. "Can you move?" Sarah asked, though she was prepared to leave Raman behind if his injuries prevented rapid movement toward her extraction point. "Yes," Raman replied through gritted teeth, using his good arm to push himself upright. "But we will not reach your extraction point before my men organize pursuit parties. They know these mountains better than you do, and they will be highly motivated to recover their leader." Sarah had already reached the same conclusion, but hearing it confirmed by Raman made their tactical situation even more sobering. The original extraction plan assumed she would be moving alone, using stealth and speed to reach a rendezvous point before enemy forces could organize effective pursuit. With a prisoner who might be injured and who certainly represented additional complications, the likelihood of successful extraction had dropped significantly. "Then we make our own luck," Sarah said, helping Raymond to his feet and beginning the desperate trek across hostile terrain toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the compound blazed with lights and activity, as dozens of armed men prepared to hunt down the American who had dared to invade their stronghold. The mission parameters had changed completely, but Sarah Chen had achieved something far more significant than the elimination of a single target. She had captured one of the region's most important Taliban commanders alive, along with intelligence that could reshape American operations throughout Afghanistan. Whether she could deliver that prize to her commanders depended on skills, determination, and luck that would be tested to their absolute limits during the dangerous hours ahead. As they disappeared into the darkness of the Hindu Kush Mountains, Sarah realized that her brother's death had indeed been avenged, though not in the way she had originally planned. Marcus had died trying to heal and help others, and his sister's mission had now evolved into something that honored his memory by potentially saving countless lives through the intelligence Raman could provide. The true power of special operations, Sarah understood, lay not in the ability to eliminate enemies but in the capacity to adapt, evolve, and find unexpected solutions to impossible problems. Tonight had proven that sometimes the greatest victory came not from pulling the trigger, but from choosing not to pull it at exactly the right moment.